Seems to me that about every Christmas time we once again hear a very well-known story of shepherds on a hillside and a baby born in a manger. And the things that we all know about the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, I'd like to try and put the story into a different perspective by looking at the world into which this man was born, and to try to get a feel from a historical perspective for why he was so effective in what he came to do. Apart from the spiritual, the mystical, the divine side of his nature, I think it's important that we know a lot more about the historical setting into which he came, just in order to understand why events happened as they did. In spite of the fact that we have heard so much about the birth and the life of Jesus Christ, and all of us are familiar with stories about Cleopatra, stories about Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Octavius. If you're like me, you probably never really connected those stories in any meaningful way with the birth of Jesus. And growing up, in spite of hearing the little bit I learned about the Roman Empire and about Egypt and Cleopatra, and what I learned about Jesus Christ on the other hand, it never really occurred to me that there was an important relationship between these. In fact, I never really set the life of Jesus into historical perspective until I really began to look into the story, so that I didn't realize that if Cleopatra had been a different kind of person, less ambitious perhaps, or if Mark Antony or Julius Caesar or Brutus or Cassius had lived their life in a different way, the story of Jesus might have been quite different. Because of that, it seems to me that those stories are inseparable. To know one, we need to know the other. We need to realize particularly that in the story of the life of Jesus and the influence that he had on the world of his time, and even on our world, we need to understand a bit better about the relationship between these world rulers and the world into which Jesus Christ was born. Perhaps the first thing that's important to know is that no other nation was so widespread throughout the world of the Roman Empire than the Jewish nation. In every major city throughout their world, there was a Jewish quarter. And the Jewish quarter in every city consisted of merchants and people who were very tight in their communication with one another, and very much still tied to their homeland, to the Jewish religion, to the influence of Judaism throughout the world. And what happened in Israel, what happened in Palestine, was important to these Jews, whether they were in Rome, in Athens, in Cairo, in Alexandria, or wherever they were throughout the world. There was no other nation of people so widespread, and because of that, there was no other group of people apart from the Romans and the Greeks themselves who were so influential upon the culture of that time. One of the reasons that they were so influential, and the reason that they were so widespread throughout the world of their time, was that they had been a conquered nation over and over and over. And sometimes, in order to make them less effective in resisting their conquerors, the people of Israel were actually displaced by their rulers. They were gathered up into groups, bands of families, and were relocated by force in other parts of the world to disperse their influence and to make them less troublemakers. And by troublemakers, perhaps we should explain a bit about what that means. During the period of the Roman Empire, all of the nations of the world conquered by Rome, were required to use Roman coins, Roman money, for their currency, except Israel. Israel was the only nation of the Roman Empire which absolutely refused to use Roman coins, particularly for their taxes which were paid to the temple. The reason for this extreme resistance to using Roman coins is that the coins of the Roman Empire were marked with images of the Caesars, who were in fact declared to be divine. They were considered gods by the Romans. And the Jews had a law handed down from Moses which forbade any graven image, particularly for the purpose of worship, but a graven image at all. A man's image on anything was forbidden to Israel. Therefore, they simply refused to use the money so marked. For that reason, special coins were minted in Israel for purpose of use in the temple, and the people of Israel simply adopted the temple coinage or temple money for use in all of commerce, because they were resistant to using the Roman coins for anything. Not only that, the young men of all of the other nations of the Roman Empire were conscripted for service. They were drafted into the Roman army, except Israel. The young men of Israel were not drafted into the Roman army because they wouldn't serve. They simply refused. And their determination was so strong that even if Rome could draft the young men, they couldn't trust them. They simply knew better than to allow the young men of Israel drafted into a Roman army to be the police force for the nation of Israel. And so this nation had a police force made up of mercenaries, primarily, taken from the countries around Israel, from Syrians and the young men of Thrace and Phoenicia. They were paid to serve as a police force in Israel, and even then they found that the service of these mercenaries was so unenjoyable that they were given 6 months out of every year on holiday for serving in Israel. The conditions under which they served there were considered so unpleasant that they had to be given that kind of consideration in order to get them to serve. So we have one nation out of the Roman Empire that was so difficult to rule that Rome considered them to be their greatest problem in ruling their empire. And the reason that they believed that the reason that Israel was such a problem was because of the strength of their religion. And the religion of Israel was quite a mystery to the rest of the world. People simply didn't understand this particular religion. They were very insular. They didn't try to bring other people into their religion. They didn't proselytize as most religions did. They sort of kept their religion to themselves. In their temple, they didn't allow any foreign element to go beyond what they called the court of the Gentiles, which was the outermost court of the temple, and it was more or less a public place, very much like a public square. Beyond that was a court of the women and then a court of the Hebrews. So what went on beyond the court of the Gentiles was simply not known to other people. And when something like that is not known, people tend to begin to guess what might go on inside those walls, and the rumors got rather interesting. There was, in fact, on the walls of Herod's temple, an enormous bunch of grapes carved out of pure gold, 40 feet across. Because of this very famous sculpture of grapes on the side, the wall of the temple, there were some who assumed that the worship must be some kind of worship of the god Bacchus, which could hardly have been further from the truth. There were others that believed that the reason that Israel didn't eat swine was because they considered them some kind of divine creature. That was a little far from the truth as well. The grammarian Apion, writing about the Jews, said that the Jews offer a Greek in sacrifice every year and eat his entrails in a religious ceremony. He also said that they worship a donkey's head. That kind of idea or rumors about the Jewish religion was widespread throughout the world, and people were constantly sort of whispering to each other about what it might be that goes on in their religion. But everyone was convinced that it was this secret religion of theirs that made them so strong and so resistant, so difficult to conquer, and then so difficult to rule after they were conquered. But they were particularly famous for this quality of independence and resistance. We might get an idea of why they were like that as we look at the history of Israel and see how it was passed like a ball from one empire to another, from one ruler to another, ruler after ruler in succession, trying to dominate this high-spirited people. It's not so much that the land that they occupied was terribly valuable. Actually, during the golden age of Israel, David had carved out something of an empire himself, which included all of what is now Israel and what is now Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. It was quite a large territory area on the eastern side of the Mediterranean that David had built into Palestine, the empire, if we can call it that, of Israel. But that didn't remain for a long time. The Golden Age lasted only through the lifetime of David and his son Solomon, and upon Solomon's death, civil war divided that nation into two parts, a northern and southern part called Israel in the north and Judea in the south. The northern part, Israel, included as much as half of the present land of Israel, most of the northern half of Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. So the bulk of the land belonged to the 10 tribes of the north that called themselves Israel. However, these 10 tribes were conquered very soon after the death of Solomon by the Syrian Empire, and then it was Sargon II that found them rather impossible to rule. There was always an uprising, always trouble in that area of the 10 tribes, and so Sargon II simply broke up the group of people and their leadership by taking whole families and sometimes whole communities and relocating them in some other area of the Syrian Empire. He would take them actually into another country and force them to be resettled there for purposes of decentralizing their communication and keeping them from having an identity as a group occupying a single geographical area. So when they were broken up like that and moved away from one another, they became an influence throughout the world. So instead of making them less trouble, he simply spread his troubles all over his empire. While they were separated and taken away from their land in the northern half of Israel, there were a few that were left behind, and this few that were left behind tended to mix and intermarry with the Assyrians and with others that were moved by Syria into their area. And these people who intermarried and occupied this area of Galilee became known as the Samaritans, a name indicating that they were not of a pure race. They were mixed. And to the Jews, they became even less than the Gentiles. They became a kind of outcast that was a name for a heretic to the religious Jew, to the extent that a Jew would not eat food prepared by the hands of a Samaritan, believing that anything that they touched was unclean. About 100 years after this fall of the northern empire to Syria, the southern kingdom of Judea was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar took the important people of Israel, the teachers, the managers, the artisans, people who had things to give, talents of value, were taken into Babylon and were treated to an opportunity to develop themselves and to become established in the Babylonian Empire. They were not treated like prisoners of war or slaves. Nebuchadnezzar called them his guests and encouraged them to develop their arts and sciences and to be a part of his kingdom. And they did. They became so involved with the empire that when they were offered an opportunity for repatriation, some 200 or more years later, many of them chose not to go back to Israel, but to remain in Babylon. Those who did return to Israel set about immediately attempting to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. What they found was that the Samaritans who had remained behind had built a new temple. But that temple was built in the hills in Samaria, and as far as the Jews were concerned, had nothing to do with their worship. And yet they had a great deal of resistance from the people remaining behind in Israel when they attempted to redevelop the real temple, as they thought of it, in the holy city of Jerusalem. Just when they were beginning to get things rebuilt in Jerusalem, they were conquered again, this time by the Macedonian Empire. Alexander the Great established military colonies and gave entire Jewish cities to veterans of his armies, gave them to become rulers in those cities and to do anything they wanted to with the property, with the people. They displaced the Jewish people, took over their property and their lands, their money, their businesses, and used these cities within Israel to be their own little empire. They gave the cities Greek names and established Greek culture and civilization in those cities. They introduced many versions of the Olympic Games with their gymnasiums, their baths, and the theater with their hippodromes and amphitheaters, so that the Jewish people were horrified with what was going on in their own country with the Hellenization of their country and their society. And young people of Israel were sometimes very attracted to this Greek way of living, the Greek customs. And in fact, the wealthier people of Israel also developed the Greek customs because it was good for their business and for trade. And so Israel was fast becoming a mini version of the Greek influence which had pervaded the Roman Empire, to the extent that people throughout Israel dressed like Greeks. Their buildings and architecture took on the appearance of Greece, and the people adopted the Greek language. In many cities, Greek was a first language, instead of the second language as it might be to a native tongue. The people of Israel were dominated, became tributaries in succession from the Persian Empire to the Macedonian, the Egyptian, the Seleucid, and then the Roman Empire, with only a few years of independence here and there between them. After Alexander came the Seleucid kings, particularly the one that possibly we should know about is a Seleucid king named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, emperor from Syria, who decided that because it was the Jewish religion that was giving the most trouble, he decided to destroy the Jewish religion. So he outlawed the Jewish rites, including circumcision and the observation of the Sabbath, and he commanded his soldiers to execute anyone who observed the Sabbath or practiced the rite of circumcision. He put up a colossal statue to the Olympian god Zeus in the Jewish temple, and he commanded that everyone worship that god or be executed. And in fact, he brought in the Jewish priests and sacrificed hogs on the sacred altars of the Jewish temple, and ordered the priests to eat the flesh of the hogs or die. They chose to die. And because they chose to die, they started a revolution. The revolution was really started by a family of warrior priests called the Maccabees. The Maccabees were a man and his 7 sons, Judah, and his 7 sons, who began to fight the Seleucid kings, one after another, taking command and destroying the enemy by striking in little places here and there in a guerrilla type of warfare that really hadn't been known, as far as we know, in the world of that era until that time. They sort of started a new tactic of warfare. And after about 25 years of fighting, they finally gained their independence. Judah's Maccabees reestablished the theocratic government, meaning that it was the high priest and the temple that operated Israel, and there was no separation between the religious laws and the secular laws of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel, for example, was as much a religious court as it was a civil court. And Judah Maccabees was declared himself, essentially, the high priest, and he made the office of high priest hereditary. People accepted him, loved him, and in fact were brought to a point of patriotism and pride that probably had not existed in Israel since the time of King David. Judah passed on his authority to his sons, one and then another, and the first successor to the throne declared himself king and established the Hasmonean dynasty of Israel. The hereditary priesthood developed then into an aristocracy and became a class system in Israel. And the aristocracy, the priesthood class, became the ruling class in Israel right on down until Herod's time. Only these of the priestly aristocracy could serve on the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court of Israel. These people of the priestly class developed into a political party and called themselves the Sadducees. The Sadducees were organized as partisans of nearly the last king of the Hasmonean dynasty, whose name was John Hyrcanus. And they organized in order to support the king's policy of conquest, that is, rebuilding the empire of Israel. And the religious people of Israel found that objectionable. They wanted this king, John Hyrcanus, to be a priest king rather than a warrior priest king. They found that for a religious man to try to conquer went against the grain of their religious convictions. And they in fact pointed to the statement of David that he couldn't build the temple to God that was his lifelong dream to build because it shouldn't be built with the hands of a warrior, a man who had killed. So they wanted their king to be a religious man and a man of peace who could serve in the temple and could serve as high priest rather than a man who was given to conquering. So the party of the Sadducees was the priestly class of people who supported this conquering idea of the king and the strength of materialism. And the Sadducees became the high officials in the government of John Hyrcanus, and they supported his policy of accommodating the foreign powers, and particularly the Roman Republic, which was not yet the Roman Empire. The Sadducees began to decline in influence by the time of Jesus, so that they were outnumbered pretty much by the Pharisees, who were the majority political party. The Pharisees were a group of people who believed very strictly in the law and in the very literal interpretation of the law. They could be called the fundamentalists of their time. They were very religious, and in fact, they tended to interpret and reinterpret and make the laws so stiff and so tough that people could scarcely live by them. The Sadducees actually lived by the law too, but they only supported the law as given by Moses. It's probably important to know now that the original Hebrew Bible was the Torah, which was first comprised only of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, as it was later called in the Greek editions. These 5 books of Moses were the original law. Now, since that time, during the few hundred years since the time of Moses, many, many books had been added to the Torah, and it was now called the Law and the Prophets instead of just the law as given by Moses. The Sadducees didn't accept any of these additional books, only the 5 books of Moses. And if it was not written in those 5 books, they didn't believe it. An example is that the Pharisees believed in reincarnation. They believed in life after death. The Sadducees did not believe in life after death because Moses never mentioned it. So if it wasn't in one of Moses' books, they simply didn't believe it. And that was the basis for their religion. There was a third political party in Israel, which amounts in a sense to a third denomination or sect of Judaism. These were called the Essenes. The Essenes were a group of people so set apart from public life that they didn't figure much into Jewish politics. They withdrew and lived alone, pretty much by themselves, in particular areas or colonies in Israel, the 2 largest being the colony at Mount Carmel on the Bay of Haifa and the colony at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, right near the Jordan. The name Essene means the expectant ones. The name Pharisee means set apart. So the Pharisees considered themselves to be set apart from average people or set apart from the world. They were set apart more than anything else by their piousness and very often by their self-righteousness. But they were sincere and faithful and tended even to be somewhat aggressive. in their insistence that the law of God be followed in Israel. There's one more group that we will run into during the life of Jesus who called themselves the Zealots. The Zealots were, for the most part, Pharisees, but they were very different from most of the Pharisees in that they were, their central belief, the thing that held them together, was their resistance to Rome. They were so strong in their resistance to Rome that they became a clandestine underground resistance movement in Israel. They met at night, sometimes in cemeteries, because, in fact, most of the religious people of Israel would not go into a cemetery, believing that that defiled them to be near the dead, and a great many were superstitious as well. But they met at night to form a resistance movement to free Israel from its domination. While the Sadducees dominated the priesthood of Israel, the Pharisees outnumbered them. Particularly important was the fact that they outnumbered them in the Sanhedrin. Now that they had been allowed to be members of the Sanhedrin, they tended to be elected by the people, so that they dominated that body of 80 lawyers who formed the Supreme Court of Israel. Now, there are some things that we really should know about the way that the government of Israel developed in that time. We've heard an awful lot about Herod, King Herod. When we read of the life of Jesus and the birth of Jesus in particular, just about the only thing that we hear about Herod the Great is that he was a monster. We hear about his famous massacre of the innocents at Bethlehem. And so I think there's probably a tendency to think of this man as some kind of uncouth, terrible ruler who had nothing really in his favor. And in fact, it might be interesting to explore why he was called the Great. If he was such a terrible ruler, how did he get that title? And how did he come to be a ruler in Israel? The story of this man's life is perhaps as interesting a story as you'll ever run across. It would make a great novel. Probably has never been presented as such a drama, only because he did turn out to be quite a monster in the end of his life, after a very, very colorful lifetime. And we can start that lifetime with the end of the Hasmonean dynasty. This is the last of the Maccabees. The dynasty ended with a queen named Alexandra. She was the last undisputed ruler of the Hasmonean line. She had 2 sons. And when she died, Alexandria passed on her kingdom to her son, Hyrcanus II. And remember that her grandfather had been Hyrcanus, one of the colorful rulers of the Hasmonean dynasty. She passed it on to her son Hyrcanus II, but she had another son named Aristobulus who deposed him. In the Hasmonean dynasty, there was a chieftain from what is now Jordan, the Edomite territory, which is the area just across the Jordan River on the east bank of the Jordan. There was a small tribe there of Edomites. It was ruled over by a very clever man, and when John Hyrcanus conquered that area, he forced all of the people who lived in that area to become Jews, to adopt the Jewish faith. And when they adopted the Jewish faith, they were formally declared to be Jews. But in spite of the fact that they were formally declared to be Jews, the people of Israel remembered that these are the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob, the father, the ancestor of the Arabs. And in the minds of the Jewish people, they would never be anything but Arabs. They simply didn't accept them as real Jews. In fact, the law of Israel said that the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, were destined to be the servants of the Jews. And they thought of them in that way and couldn't accept that they had any other real destiny. Now, there was an interesting thing about that period of time that men such as this chieftain of the Edomites wanted their youngsters to have good education. And wherever a person, a parent throughout the empire was interested in a quality education for their children, there was a tendency to call upon the ACIM sect to be tutors, teachers of their children, for a very special reason. The people of the Essenes would not take an oath, even in a court of law. And the reason that they wouldn't take an oath in the court of law was because they believed that every word that came out of their mouth must be so truthful as to never need to swear an oath. Every word that they said, in their thinking, was as sacred as any oath that could be taken. Therefore, to take any oath would be to suggest that there was something special about what they were going to say after the oath, as different from what they said in their everyday language. Now, this is to say that integrity and honesty were so vital to the life of these people. The development of character and the perfection of character were so important that that every word that they said, every act of their life was as nearly perfect in character and honesty and integrity as they could manage. Even the law itself took this into account, because as the law was established in Israel, the code did everything that it could do to be fair, in that, for example, to formalize a contract required 2 witnesses. To convict a man in court required 2 eyewitnesses if the accusation was a capital crime. But the law provided that this didn't apply if a witness was an Essene. It was recognized that the Essenes were so honest and so committed to honesty that their word was accepted without question. And because of this development of character, and because of the discipline that was involved in this development of character, the Essenes were known worldwide for such a quality of character and the ability to teach it. And the aristocracy, even in Rome and in Greece and in the country surrounding Israel, liked to have a tutor of the Essenes for their children to develop that quality of character within them. So it was that the chieftain of the Edomites had an Essene tutor to teach his young sons, 2 sons. And the Edomite chieftain, when his territory was taken over by John Hyrcanus, was made a minor official in Israel because of his willingness. I mean, obviously, there was not much point in fighting the armies of Israel with his little tribe. And so the conquering of his tribe really amounted to a political deal. Then the chieftain became, at first, a minor functionary in the government of Israel, but as a clever man, he worked his way up, and worked his way up very quickly, so that he moved into the highest ranks of government. And his son then succeeded him. His son's name was Antipater. And Antipater was present at the time that Queen Alexandra died, and she passed on her kingdom to Hyrcanus II. Aristobulus then deposed Hyrcanus II, but Antipater went to Hyrcanus and urged him to stand up for his rights. And to stand up for his rights meant that he had to go to Pompey the Great, who was the developing head of the Roman Empire. And as it turns out, both of these young princes, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, both appealed to Pompey the Great to reinforce their right to the throne. As it turned out, Pompey had more interest in Antipater than he did in either of the young princes. So while he sided with the prince that was supported by Antipater, he didn't make him the ruler of Israel. Instead, he made him the high priest, and he gave the rulership of Israel to Antipater. So Antipater then, of the Edomites, became the ruler of Judea, the southern half of Israel, and he managed to get Pompey to give the northern half of Israel to his son Herod. Herod had a brother, Phasael, who was involved with them in ruling Israel. And Antipater had enough foresight to ally himself with Rome, first through Pompey, and then connected himself with Julius Caesar when the fortunes of war ran against Pompey and with Julius Caesar. His good judgment won him the appointment as procurator of Judea, which meant that his son, Herod, his two sons, actually had the opportunity to serve in the Roman army and served in Egypt. This meant that Herod served side by side with a young man, a young soldier, brave young soldier of the Roman Empire, whose name was Anthony. The two of them became very good and fast friends while they were soldiers in Egypt. And they both served Julius Caesar in his rise to power. But when the Civil War broke out then, following the assassination of Caesar, and then Cassius seized control of the East, Antipater and Phasael and Herod survived that civil war by collecting money for Cassius to finance his part of the war. So Cassius then owed them some allegiance. When Antipater then was poisoned by one of his enemies, Herod took over in his place. Then when Brutus and Cassius were defeated at Philippi, Herod appealed to Anthony on the grounds that Cassius had given him no choice but to serve him. And as fortune would have it, Herod and Anthony, having been such fast friends in the army of Julius Caesar in Egypt, and Anthony being somewhat of a practical man as well as appreciating old friendships, he granted to Herod all of the prestige and position and power that had belonged to his father Antipater. Then when the Parthians invaded Judea, they killed Phasael, Herod's brother, and they placed Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, on the throne. Now this is the young prince of the Hasmoneans that Herod had displaced. So Herod barely escaped with his life. He ran away to Rome. When Herod turned up in Rome as an exile, Mark Antony presented him to the Senate and recounted his past service to Rome in the presence of the Senate. And he secured the support of Octavian and made a motion in the Senate that Herod should be declared king of the Jews. The motion carried, and the new king left the Senate on the arms of Octavian and Anthony for a great banquet in Herod's honor. And from that moment, he gained for himself a kingdom and a place in history. He returned to Palestine with the legions of Sosius, the governor of Syria, who was given orders by Caesar to implement the act of the Senate, which declared Herod to be the king of the Jews. This meant another bloody siege in Jerusalem. And after the fight, Herod was seated on the throne. Antigonus was beheaded in Antioch by the order of Antony. And it sort of ended the last hope for the Hasmonean dynasty. But during the early years of Herod's rule, he had a hard time hanging on to either his crown or even his head because of the things that happened in Rome. First of all, there was the ascendancy of Cleopatra and her extreme influence over Mark Antony. Cleopatra was a very ambitious woman, and one of the things that was foremost in her mind was that she wanted Palestine to be a province of Egypt. And in order to try and get that, she first made advances to Herod to seduce him. Herod showed probably a little more discrimination than Mark Antony, in that he turned her down, which didn't make her happy at all. She went to Mark Antony and sort of turned the story around and accused Herod of having made advances toward her, and sort of challenged Mark Antony's manhood, I suppose, to do something about Herod. But Herod was very good at maneuvering this kind of situation. So he gathered the gold of Israel, including the gold that belonged to the temple, and gave it to Mark Antony, and swayed him sufficiently, at least so that instead of getting the land of Palestine as a province of Egypt, all that Cleopatra really got was some of the coastal cities of Israel, 2 or 3, and something else that she had wanted very much. Cleopatra was rebuilding the glories of the ancient schools, mystery schools and libraries of Egypt, and she had found a place with freshwater springs. Near the new city of Cairo, she established for herself a place called Heliopolis, the city of the sun. She built there a great temple and a great library, and she wanted for her temple and her library some of the famous balsam bushes and spice bushes of Jericho and the Jordan. These famous gardens that were looked after by the Essene colonies. So Herod arranged for these gardens of the Essenes to be carried away into Egypt along with gardeners to look after them. An interesting sidelight perhaps here is that there's a story of a young gardener who worked among the spice bushes and the balsam bushes and the gardens of the Essenes. And like most of the Essene people, he prayed at least 5 times a day. And as he went about his work, praying at the same time, he was very much aware of the predictions of a Messiah who would lead the people of Israel out of domination and into a new and glorious kingdom. Every one of the Essenes looked forward to the coming of the Messiah. In fact, the coming of the Messiah was really the purpose of the establishment of the Essene colonies. They moved out away from the people and took themselves out of the public for the specific purpose of creating an atmosphere into which the Messiah could come. They reasoned that with all of the things that were going on in developing civilization, it wasn't a fit atmosphere for the coming of a Messiah. They had read all of the prophecies from Daniel, from Isaiah, from most of the ancient prophecies. The prophecies that spoke of the Messiah coming. And they thought of the conditions into which he must come as being a sacred place, a sacred time, a sacred people set apart certainly to lead the people out of the kind of conditions that they saw in the world around him, but they reasoned that there had to be a kind of a cradle into which he would be born, and particularly that meant that there had to be a woman, a virgin, according to the prophecies, had to be prepared, cultivated, to have a life and a heart so pure that she could be used as a vessel for the birth of this Messiah. And it was for that reason that they gave themselves the name Essenes, a name which means expectancy, or the expectant ones. Or perhaps a more literal translation is they called themselves the pregnant people. And they thought of themselves as being pregnant with expectancy of the birth of this king, this teacher, the Messiah. And they took their job seriously in the sense that they cultivated the life of the young girls of their community to the extent that they would never curse or use any coarse language or actions or even thoughts in the presence of one of these young girls. They established the tradition that women must be so honored, approached with such deference, because they are the womb, the incubator for the life of the future, and in this case particularly for the life of the Messiah. The belief of the Essenes was that even a thought, a negative thought, an unkind or angry emotion in the presence of one of these young girls could keep her body, her mind, her vehicle from being pure enough to become the vessel through which the Messiah could enter. And so theirs was a life of constant prayer, constant dedication and communication with God. They were a people who believed in prophecy. They believed in reincarnation. They believed in astrology and mysticism. They interpreted dreams. They gave a lot of attention to gematria, which was the Hebrew system of numerology. And they adopted some of the customs of the Chaldeans, who were very much given to the occult sciences, except that the Essenes practiced these arts in accordance with the sacred scriptures, and to them nothing was more important than the Torah and the study of the law and the prophets. In fact, it was so important to them that they became the people who first committed the Torah to writing, what had been an oral tradition passed down word for word from initiate to initiate, and kept alive by oral tradition, was committed to writing by the Essenes, but not circulated among the people. It was committed to writing and stored in jars, sealed, to protect it for the future. The Essenes believed that the Messiah would soon come, and after that, the end of the world, and they believed that that would not be long. In fact, one of the prophecies of the Old Testament had suggested, a prophecy of Daniel had said that the coming of the Messiah would be 70 weeks after the people had returned to Israel to rebuild the temple. And so he had dated the coming time of the Messiah. Now, 70 weeks had long since passed, and the Messiah had not come, and the Pharisees and the Essenes and many others had reinterpreted that to mean 70 weeks of weeks instead of 70 weeks of days, which meant that if you multiplied 70 times 7, it would give the number of weeks from the rebuilding of the temple to the time of the coming of the Messiah. Now, the interesting thing about that is that if you count that period of time, 70 weeks or 70 weeks of weeks, from the time of the building of the rebuilding of the temple. When the people returned to Israel, that time would have passed just about 10 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. Or, if you considered the building of the temple by Herod to be the beginning of the prophecy, if you considered that temple to be the rebuilding that Daniel was speaking of, then 70 weeks was accomplished just about the same year that Jesus Christ was born. So the Essenes were looking at that prophecy, among others, and because that they were astrologers, they knew what the signs of the heavens were saying. And they had committed their lives and their work and their thoughts to the ushering in of this Messiah, and they knew fairly specifically when this Messiah would come. They knew, in fact, that there were two heavenly bodies known as Jupiter first and Saturn, and that there was a particular sign of the heavens that was important to them, important for several different reasons. The period in which the Essenes existed was called the period or the age of Aries, the age of the ram. And the symbol for that age in Israel was the ram's horn that was blown to signal the beginning of worship. And they knew that the change of the age to the age of Pisces was upon them. They knew approximately when that change in the age would occur. And it was not so much the sun that was important to these particular astrologers, so much as it was important to the Chaldees and to the Egyptians, but the other planets was given much more importance in the minds of the Hebrew astrologers, particularly in that Jupiter was considered to be the royal planet, the planet of expansiveness and freedom, the planet of benevolent rule, and it was the planet that blessed things and caused things to happen with joy, and the position of that planet very often heralded the birth of a king. The planet Saturn, on the other hand, was a planet that represented to them, and had represented to astrologers all over the world, the God of Israel, because the God of Israel was seen more than any of the gods of the other nations to be a God of discipline. The people of Israel were called the chosen people, and very often it's been thought that the Hebrew nation must have been a bit arrogant, egotistical, because of this idea of being the chosen people. But in fact, if you look at the serious religious people of Israel, you'll find that the idea of their being the chosen people was not seen by them so much as being a compliment as being a burden, a responsibility. They considered it a very important responsibility that, as the chosen people, the way they related to God determined the time when God would bring all nations of the world together to be one. Their belief said that at the end of time, depending upon how the chosen people related to God and whether they made it possible, at the end of time, God would bring all nations together and would be a God of all nations instead of just the God of the chosen people. But the responsibility for bringing that about was upon the shoulders of the chosen people, Israel. And so Saturn was representative of this disciplinarian God whose purpose was to perfect people through sort of keeping their nose to the grindstone and perfecting their character and their way of life. The astrologers of the Essenes knew that In the year that we would number 7 BC, these two planets, Jupiter and Saturn, would come together, form a stellium with some of the other planets in the sign of Pisces. Now, because this was the birth time of the age of Pisces, and because it involved the planet of royalty, Jupiter, it was interpreted by the ACIM astrologers and astrologers of other parts of the world. It was interpreted to mean that there would be an important ruler born in Israel at that time, and that his work would be symbolized by the planet Jupiter, the expansive force, would make a station between the Earth and Saturn, would eclipse Saturn, the restrictive disciplinary planet. And that was supposed by them to mean that what had been a very strict disciplinarian rule would now be very open and free and supportive and expansive in nature. So it was thought that this king would be a king of liberation and would even change somewhat the nature, the influence of the religion of Israel. And happening in the constellation Pisces, the belief was that this would give birth to the age of Pisces, and would make this king, this ruler, a ruler of the world. An interesting sidelight on this is that there are records found in China of astrologers in China who observed the same phenomena in the heavens at the same time. They set out from China in about 10 BC to travel from China toward Israel, toward the country of the West, to find this new Messiah. On their way, they discovered Gautama Buddha and recognized him as a great ruler and carried word and teaching of Buddha back to China. It is not yet discovered whether they finally also found the Christ in Israel. But it's very likely that they did so, since in the Hebrew scriptures or the Christian scriptures there is the story of the astrologers of the East who came to worship the Christ at his birth. This young man of the Essenes, the Essene gardener, who was aware of all of this, knowing just when this Messiah would be born, the time when he was expected, spent a lot of his time in prayer that he would have the opportunity of being a gardener for the Messiah when he came. And so he made his task of gardening, looking after the balsam bushes and the spice bushes, he made that a spiritual task to purify himself and develop himself that he might be honorable enough to be considered for a position of a gardener, at least one of the gardeners, to serve the Messiah when he came. Probably in his mind thinking of this Messiah as a king, because some of the prophecies had spoken of him in that way, particularly the prophecies, the favorite prophecies perhaps of the Essenes. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders. And of his kingdom there shall be no end. He was declared as a ruler of peace. So they thought of him as the Prince of Peace, the man who would establish a government and would be a king. And this young man, called Ishmael, had looked forward to having the opportunity to serve him. Now suddenly, because Cleopatra was looking for spice and herb gardens for her pagan temple, Ishmael was plucked up out of the Essene communities, was drafted, as it were, or imprisoned by Herod, and forced to go into Egypt and to live near the new city of Cairo, to live in Heliopolis, and there to establish and care for the spice bushes and the herbs that were transferred there. He had a new job then to develop these in Egypt, and apparently he did quite a good job, because this area of Cairo and Heliopolis became famous as the Gardens of Jericho, as a source of the sweet oils of balsam throughout the world. It became actually an industry of that part of the world as a result of Ishmael and possibly other gardeners who established the gardens there in the shadows of the new temples of Cleopatra. It interests me that when Ishmael arrived in Heliopolis, he arrived not only with these spice and balsam bushes and herbs for the gardens of Cleopatra, he also brought plants for himself. According to the stories, he arrived there broken-hearted, believing that being in Egypt, he would miss the birth of the Messiah. He wouldn't be in Israel where it would occur. So he went with a heavy heart, and yet believing, as the Essenes did, that one must live in harmony with the authorities. He went. And he planted a tree of his own in the garden of his own home that he had brought with him and lovingly cared for from Israel. The tree grew, and in fact that particular tree still stands today in Heliopolis, in the outskirts of Cairo. It's the only tree that you can find in all of Egypt that has lived for 2,000 years. It quit putting out leaves just a few years ago in our lifetime. But fortunately, one of the Coptic Christians of Egypt, who very much loved this tree, which they call the Mary tree, took a cutting off that tree some years ago and planted it in his own garden, in his home, and it flourished. And when the ancient tree stopped putting out leaves just a few years ago, this man took a cutting of his cutting and planted it at the foot of that tree, so that the child of the Mary tree is still putting out leaves and flourishing to this day. And the trunk and the limbs of the ancient trees still stand and form a sort of a little place of peace amid a very noisy section of Heliopolis today, a little garden where one can go and stand on the ground that once was a lawn on which the child Christ played. And so Ishmael, thinking that he had been taken away from the opportunity to serve in the gardens of Christ, actually found that his prayer was answered, not quite in the manner that he had envisioned it, perhaps even better. Because the story tells us that when Herod became aware of the birth of Jesus, and Joseph and Mary became aware that it was important to protect him, they took him away into Egypt. And taking him away into Egypt, they took him to this city on the banks of a freshwater stream that had been the sacred city of Cleopatra, the city of Heliopolis, to the home of Ishmael the gardener, where they were taken in by him. And so he became not only the gardener to the Messiah, but the Messiah actually as a child became his house guest. And so it sort of illustrates for me, I think, the principle that we should be somewhat careful in the way that we pray, particularly if we should think in our prayers that we know better than the source of life itself, what is good for us. And if we insist that our prayers be answered exactly as we pray them, we might be insisting on less than God had in mind to give us. Perhaps one of the more important stories or lessons to learn about the coming of the Messiah and what it meant in the life of a particular person. Herod found himself loyal to Anthony at the wrong time, because when Anthony was in trouble, and Anthony and Cleopatra were losing everything they had to Octavian and Agrippa, Herod couldn't join Antony to serve him in battle because of the jealous nature of Cleopatra. And it meant that Herod cast his lot with Octavian and Agrippa. And as Cleopatra and Antony lost everything, and Octavian was well aware that Herod had been one of Antony's best friends, it meant that Antony's friends throughout the world were running for their lives to any place they could find in the empire to hide from Octavian. But Herod actually did just the opposite. Herod went directly to Cyprus to visit Octavian and stood in his court and said to him, "I've been a very loyal, faithful friend to Anthony," and he had. And that was reason enough for Octavian to destroy him, except that Herod, in his great speech before Octavian and Agrippa at that time, pointed out that if he could be so loyal and so faithful a friend to Anthony, the Caesar, that he could be just as loyal and just as faithful to Octavian. And history records that Herod gave such a great speech that it brought tears to the eyes of the Caesar. And he accepted him then as a friend, and in fact even imparted to him the very important title of Friend of Caesar. And once more, Herod was established as King of the Jews. In fact, he was given the title of the Great, and he was said to be the closest friend of Caesar, except for Caesar's son-in-law, Marcus Agrippa. And it was also said that Herod was Agrippa's best friend, except for his father-in-law, Caesar. The problems that Herod ran into in Palestine in ruling the people of Israel, it came from several different directions. First of all, the fact that he was not a Jew. They still considered him to be an Edomite and not Jewish. They resented him as a foreigner, an Arab. They resented even more than that his relationship with the Caesar, and the fact that he had talked Caesar into to conquering Israel just for his own purposes, so that he could be king. They really resented that, the bloodbath that caused. They resented him because he was famous throughout the world as a builder of cities and of temples and of buildings. But he built those cities as Greek cities, and in fact, he even built a great temple in Rome. And the Jews of Rome reported to the Jews back home the embarrassing moment of Herod walking with Caesar to worship the god Zeus in the great temple that he had built in Rome. They resented him because of the people of Israel that were killed for his purposes, in spite of the fact that he was a great ruler in the sense that during his reign there were no highway robbers in Israel. One could travel the highways throughout Israel without fear of being set upon by thieves and robbers. He had eliminated the troubles in the bureaucracy, the dishonesty. He had an efficient government. In all those ways, he was an important ruler, a good ruler. He even tried to win the favor of the Jewish people by building for them a great temple. And the people loved the temple, and they hated Herod. spread his rulership to all of Palestine and covered the areas that had been a part of the empire of David, and became a strong and important ruler of his time. But toward the end of his time, he had become so paranoid, so distrusting, even of his own family, that he wound up killing his own wives and his own sons. He married a princess of the Maccabees, of the Hasmonean Empire, named Mariamne, and had by her 2 sons. She was the wife that he loved the most, and yet he began to distrust her, and because of his distrust for her, he killed her and both of her sons. He had married her in the first place to try and make his rule a bit more legitimate, to tie himself to the Hasmonean dynasty. But it didn't work, and people didn't trust him. And so Herod finally, with all his successes, became old and sick. And as sick as he was in his body, and he really was, his body was full of boils and sores that ran. Even Caesar sent his own physician to treat Herod, and it didn't help. Everything was tried that was known in the world to try and help him. But as sick as his body was, his mind was even worse. So much so that he appointed his oldest remaining son to be his successor, and then, just months before his death, killed him, leaving him with only 2 more sons, and neither of them particularly capable of running an empire, and neither one of them particularly trusted, even by him. But he had sort of eliminated everyone else through his distrust. He'd become bitter. The people of Israel that he wanted to love him refused. And he was so desperate that people should care when he died, should mourn him when he died, that he made an arrangement with his son, an arrangement that all of the men of the most important families of Israel, 500 of them, would be imprisoned. And the agreement was, with his son Archelaus, that on the day that Herod died, these 500 men of important families would be killed, so that the day of Herod's death would be mourned. It was this kind of sick thinking that made Herod so hated in his last days. And it was to this kind of a consciousness that the wise men, the astrologers, came seeking the birth of a new king in Israel. They came sort of assuming that the new prince of Israel would be born to the royal family, and so they might find him in the palace of Herod. But when they came and found such an old and decrepit man, and when they realized that he was much more likely to destroy this new prince than to support him, the wise men almost fled from his presence, following what appeared to be an exceptionally bright star. Now, the Star of Bethlehem may be a phenomena that is not recorded in history, but at the same time we find that it is true that there was a stellium in the constellation of Pisces in the year of Christ's birth. This stellium first formed in February of the year 7 BC, meaning that the 2 planets, Saturn and Jupiter, along with some of the faster-moving planets, came together, forming what would probably look like one pool of light in the southern sky. They, after coming together, Jupiter went retrograde, or Saturn went retrograde, and they moved away from each other for a few months, coming together again in the year, in the month of August in that same year. They formed a station again at that time, which appears to be the time when the when the astrologers set out from the east to come to Israel. And then they came together again, passing each other. They went direct and retrograde again, so that they formed a stellium for the third time in December, about December 11th of 7 BC, had formed a perfect station on one another about midnight of December 11th. And it was about that time, it said, that the new Caesar had attempted to reestablish his census of that particular country, of several countries of the empire of the time. And it meant apparently that Joseph had a piece of property in Bethlehem on which he had to appear in person to register for the taxes on that property. Whether he wanted to or not, even if he didn't want the property, the law of Israel said that he couldn't pass it on, that it must remain in his household and to his heirs. And if that was to happen, he must appear in person to pay the taxes in the city of Bethlehem, which was quite a long ways from the place of his home. He had established a home in the north of Israel, in a place called Nazareth. It wasn't much of a town. It was, in fact, somewhat a wilderness. There was just a spring there and a few families that lived around it. It was not an established city. And it was in an area that the Jews of Jerusalem considered to be an outpost, something that I suppose you might call hillbilly country. The people of that area didn't speak good Hebrew or even good Aramaic, and certainly not good Greek. They spoke it with an accent that the Jews of Jerusalem tended to describe as a kind of slurring accent, not pronouncing their words well. They were thought of as ignorant, and many of them were actually not of the 12 tribes, which meant that although they were considered Jews, living and growing up in Israel and being a part of the nation, if they weren't of the 12 tribes, then they weren't of a pure strain, and they were considered Gentiles by the Jews of Jerusalem. And so it was not an area of people that were considered very highly regarded, except for the fact that the Essenes had established their colonies there in this part of the country, one at Carmel and one at a place called Qumran on the banks of the Dead Sea. And Joseph and his wife, Miriam or Myra, had become a part of that sect or tribe. Actually, they belonged to a wing of the Essenes called the Nazarenes, which gave name to this place called Nazareth. A little outpost of Essenes lived there by the spring, and the Nazarenes were a sort of sub-sect, if it could be called that, of Israel. They called themselves Nazarenes because the term referred to a person who had taken a special oath before God. And the oath was usually symbolized by some kind of special act of theirs. As an example, Samson of the Old Testament was a Nazarite, and his oath was that he would never cut his hair. That was his contract, if it can be called that, with God. So the Nazarenes had given up something special to symbolize their covenant, their particular personal covenant with God. And Joseph and Mary were both of this subculture of the Essenes who lived in Nazareth. They traveled to Bethlehem to pay the tax. Even though Mary was in the last month of her pregnancy, and it's not a time when it is particularly safe, according to the midwives, for a pregnant woman to travel such a distance. And yet, she went. And a lot of people have questioned why. And it might be an important thing for us to look at. It may be that the only reason that Mary traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem in this last stage of her pregnancy was because she knew, as well as anybody, of the prophecies of the Messiah. She had been told by an angel that her child was the Messiah, born of God and not of man. And it was important to fulfill the prophecies, and the prophecy said that he would be born in Bethlehem. She may have traveled there, knowing that when she arrived there, he would be born. She may have traveled there only for that purpose, and it may not have been just because of the necessity of the tax. That apparently helped in getting Joseph there. But he didn't have to travel with Mary, and yet he chose to. Arriving in Bethlehem, it was found that there was no room for them at the only inn in this tiny little town just 7 miles south of Jerusalem. But the people at the inn and people around who were sympathetic to the Essenes were very much concerned that there was no place for her, and there was a whole group of people, a whole host of people who set about looking for any place that might be comfortable for this pregnant girl to have her child on that night. But the most comfortable place that they could find was a little cave behind the inn where the animals were kept. It's important that it might have been a cave, the womb of the earth, and in the presence of animals, highly symbolic that the child of God should be born among the animals. And so she was installed there, and the people of the inn did all they could do to make her comfortable in this manger, as she had already gone into labor by the time she was installed there in the warmth of the place, even though it was a cool December night. It's interesting that on this night the skies were bright because of this very unusual star. People who didn't know astrology were very much aware of this special star and the special light in the sky, and they whispered about it. The hills around Bethlehem and Jerusalem were covered with people camping out because there simply weren't facilities for people to be accommodated in Jerusalem and Bethlehem at such a time when so many people must come there and register. And when people come together for a festival such as that, there is a lot of drinking, partying, singing. And these partying people, distracted from their cares by their drinking and partying that night, were not terribly aware of the things that happened around midnight, or at least not so aware of last moments of her labor as the contractions came closer together, and the mother, the wife of the keeper of the inn, rushed back and forth to look after her. She came suddenly out into the night and found the night sky brighter than day, with a light that suddenly shone about midnight so bright that it was like something in the sky had opened up, and something like the sun was shining over the place of the stable, and she rushed in to find a baby born, and came to find an atmosphere that was hushed and quiet, not perhaps like the usual scene of the birth of a child, when there is excitement and congratulations to the parents, but the parents themselves in this moment were in awe of the child who came. A child that they already had known was a very special child, but a child who, as they looked at him, had a strange relationship with them, particularly with the mother, perhaps, because although coming from her body, she giving birth to him, she at the same time was aware that she was looking upon a baby who was the manifestation of God himself in the flesh, someone who lived before she did, And it might be interesting to imagine being the parent of a child that one knows will one day be the master, the Lord, the presence of God expressing himself in the flesh. There must be a sense of joy. There was a sense of worship of this child, a sense of love and a sense of pride. At the same time, there must have been a terrible sense of responsibility. How would you face a world not knowing and not understanding the nature of your child? How would you explain the presence of a child in your household that you yourself felt a responsibility to worship? How do you explain the presence of a child so precocious and so responsible in early childhood that he had more of a tendency to parent the parents than they had to parent him, knowing the superiority of his understanding of life and purpose and God and the relationship of God? How do you stand looking in the face of a newborn baby and consider the possibility that a presence bigger than the universe has entered the earth, one of the smallest of the planets of the universe? How does anything so great contract itself so small as to enter into a tiny baby and look out through those eyes? How can the power that created the universe make itself so vulnerable as to lie there in the presence of humans, in the body of a tiny, vulnerable, and we might assume helpless little baby? It may be that the greatest miracle of all time occurred when the greatest made itself the least. How could it happen? How could all that God is make himself so tiny as to be held in human hands and to take nourishment at a human breast? But as we consider that wonder, we also need to consider that the essence of his life was to teach us that that happened when you were born. That we should know that even as God entered the world in human form that night 2,000 years ago to make a difference in the world, so God entered the world the day you were born. And what this baby in Bethlehem had potential to be was a potential that you were born with. And the destiny of that child born that night, according to his own teaching, was your destiny and your purpose for being born. It interests me that this baby, this ruler of the universe, did not choose the most luxurious or comfortable of times to be born, or places, or nations, but appeared to have chosen the most difficult period in every way, politically, technologically, socially. He seemed to have chosen the most difficult period in all of time in which to enter a physical body and grow up under adverse conditions. It seemed to be that God's purpose in that moment was to demonstrate for you and me that under the very most adverse conditions, that a man can set aside the limitations of adversity, that man can conquer every power capable of working against us, and in spite of them, perfectly express God through the flesh, to the extent of eliminating all that is born of fear, and being born one absolutely without fear, absolutely the incarnation of love itself. Living love was born to demonstrate to the world that love is more powerful than fear. There are two things that I would like to accomplish tonight in looking at the life of the Master, Jesus the Christ. I'd particularly like to help you to know him as a person, as a friend, as a real living being, instead of just a sort of legend from a strange land in a strange time, difficult to relate to. And I'd also like to, in a sense, separate the man from the myth. We are inclined today, as much as people were perhaps at the time of the birth of Jesus, to have our own ideas about what a holy man is like, what a holy man should be. And because of our ideas, there has been a tendency to somewhat ignore, I think, what is written about him and what is quoted from his own words, and to color him somewhat differently than the record really suggests that he was. So I would like to invoke that very real presence here tonight, so that we get to know him not just through words and description, but through an experience of the presence. At the same time, there's something else I'd like to do, as well as we can. This has to do with a curiosity of my own. For all the years that I've been aware of the story of Jesus, the life of the Christ, I've been curious about the 12th apostle, Judas. There has been a tendency through most of Christianity to consider Judas sort of the ultimate betrayer, a vile sort of man, with no good intent or purpose, and to portray him as a man whose intent from the beginning, perhaps, was to betray Jesus. There's a lot about that doesn't quite make sense. It never made sense to me why the temple, the high priesthood of Israel, would need anyone to lead them to Jesus, when they apparently knew very well where he was, almost all the time. So to hire Judas for 30 pieces of silver to take them to the Christ didn't make much sense. Never made much sense to me. And also, if his intent was so negative, evil, how could his negativity or doubt of the Christ survive his experience as an eyewitness to miracle after miracle after miracle, and to the words of Christ and the presence of the Christ. What kind of man with evil intent or with doubt could survive all that? On the other side of the coin, there has always been, I think, a tendency among loving people to want to be merciful to Judas, to sort of redeem him. So there have been some writers and teachers who have painted Judas almost as the ultimate saint, in the sense of suggesting that this man of the 12 had the hardest job to do. If Jesus was to be betrayed, if Scripture was to be fulfilled, then this apparently was his assignment. And there have been some who have even suggested that Judas was an archangel, walking among the apostles for the specific purpose of accomplishing this one last act that would lead to the crucifixion, a sort of a crowning initiation in the life of Christ. Those are the two extremes, it seems to me, and somewhere between them must be found this man Judas. I have been and still am curious about where he fits. So the approach that I would like to take tonight to try to come to know Jesus and to come to know Judas at the same time is the approach of attempting to sort of invoke the presence of Judas, to look at Jesus through his eyes and to see what happens, to see what the story looks like as Judas would tell it. And in doing that, I would like to try not to offer any opinions of my own, because frankly I don't know. I would like rather to allow Judas to tell his own story, as nearly as that can be accomplished, and see what comes of that, and whether or not it rings true with us and our own experience, and whether it offers any satisfaction to this mystery of why Judas did what he did, what the 30 pieces of silver had to do with it. I mean, if he wanted them so badly, why did he throw them away immediately after he received them? Did he do it for money? Was it to force Jesus to reveal himself, so that perhaps it was a misguided attempt on Judas' part to force the hand of Jesus, to make him reveal himself as the Messiah and lead an army against Rome? Is that a possibility? Is that the explanation? And if so, if that's what he wanted to do, then why did he bargain for 30 pieces of silver? The questions are almost unresolvable with the information that we have given to us in the Bible, as far as I can see. All of the answers that I have heard in all of the years of studying this story haven't yet come up with a reasonable answer to these questions for me. So I'd like to ask Judas to explain himself and his thinking and his memory of the events that took place, along with his motivation.